Welcome to the series What Jesus Meant. Hello, I'm happy to introduce you to the series of biblical messages by Dr.Valson Thampu titled What Jesus Meant. As the title suggests, here is an attempt to unveil the deeper dimensions of Jesus' teachings. But being a Christian is not a requirement for viewing them. Jesus is presented here as the light of the world and not as the icon of a religion. Valson is a voice heard with attention as a teacher, thinker, author, and preacher in Christian and secular contexts in India for over 4 decades. He teaches as one excited about the contemporary relevance of Jesus' spiritual vision. Through these video messages, he offers the fragrance of a fresh understanding of what it means to be Christian. This is a study series without academic rigors. For best results, viewers need to pursue the trail of thought to the end as a learning and unlearning experience. We hope you enjoy.
A warm welcome to everyone to this series of discussions on the meaning and scope of Jesus' teachings. Today we address an issue which is so very central to our religious life, and that from the perspective of Jesus. To Jesus, a major issue to be faced and overcome in our religious life is the issue of fear. Fear interferes very seriously with our religious life. So I'm going to title our session today as Jesus and Religious Fear. And as a kind of indication to what we are trying to say, let me just make a reference to Matthew chapter 10, in particular to 2 verses, verse 16 and verse 28. In verse 16, we read Jesus saying to his disciples, "Behold, I sent you like sheep among wolves." I mean, the context, of course, is that of Jesus sending his disciples out on their mission journeys. So Jesus says, look, this is what it is about. I sent you like sheep among wolves. And in the 28th verse, Jesus says, "Fear not. Do not fear those who can only destroy your body. So fear not." Now, in this context, Jesus is actually marking for our particular attention a problem so very fundamental to our religious life. So, now if you look at the human situation, universally it's very obvious that fear is at the root of human condition. To exist is to experience fear. And no human being is safe from this or protected from this. No matter how high, exalted your position is, how worldly secure you are, you still live in a world of fear. Now, this fear becomes particularly acute in the sphere of religion, and that's what we are going to consider. Now, if you look at the essence of this fear, you will realize that irrespective of the diversity of the context in which we experience fear, the essence of fear is just one thing, and that is the fear of differences, or our inability to deal wholesomely, confidently, and creatively with differences. So, now think of a bird perched on the parapet of a very tall skyscraper. And you go and stand there. Your knees, your legs will melt in fear, whereas the bird sits there without any concern. What's the difference? The difference is the bird knows that it can cope with the the fall if that happens. Whereas human beings, if they fall, they'll crash like an egg. So it's our inability to deal with something that activates fear in us. Now consider another example. For an infant, a snake is only as good or bad as a toy is. Whereas for an adult, a snake instills or provokes primeval fears. What's the difference between the infant and the adult? The infant is unaware of differences, and the adult is acutely aware of this. Hence the fear. So now I'm going to tell you something which very likely you have not heard before. And that's because this particular phenomenon, which plays an important role in the story of the Bible, has been represented and misrepresented in all kinds of ways. Now, for example, what is the satanic principle in the Bible? Now, our idea of Satan is derived mostly from the portrayal of Satan by artists. And if you look at all of those portrayals, you will find that the artist takes particular pains to exaggerate the difference between us and Satan. Now, there is certainly an insight in this, but that insight is artistic, not spiritual. Let's look at the spiritual difference. From the teachings of Jesus Christ, it is fairly obvious, and there's no doubt left on this, that Satan is really the objectification of our fear of differences. Let me give you a concrete illustration so that you understand that I'm deriving this insight only from the Gospel. In the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, you have that very enigmatic, disturbing event in which Jesus apparently addresses Peter as Satan. You know, when Jesus tells the disciples that he was about to go to Jerusalem there to be persecuted and killed, Peter suddenly intervenes. Something erupts from Peter because this is something that he did not expect. Peter says, I will not let this happen to you. So Jesus is addressing that particular eruption from deep within Peter, and he's addressing that as Satan. Get thee behind me, Satan. Right? So the satanic principle is very clear as far as Jesus is concerned. It is not the individual Peter, but that particular aspect of human nature which is just incapable of dealing with the different. See, in this case, Peter had his expectations after he acclaimed Jesus to be the Son of the living God, the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. He had his own expectations. But what Jesus tells him thereafter dashes all his expectations to pieces. And that's why something erupts from within. And Jesus addresses that as Satan. Now consider for a moment the temptation of Jesus Christ in the wilderness. Each time, Jesus responds to the temptation that Satan brings to him in a manner that would illustrate something of profound value for humanity once and for all, and that is the duty to be different. See, Satan is trying to coerce Jesus into his mode of thinking. This is the way to do it. But each time, Jesus differs from him. And therefore, the spiritual message in the temptation of Jesus Christ is that we have a duty to differ from, the duty to dissent. This is something that Christendom has forgotten completely. There is a duty to dissent. There is a duty to be different. And that duty to be different also includes the duty to respect, accept differences. Now, Take the second verse of the 12th chapter of Paul's letter to Romans. It reads like this: do not conform to the pattern of the world. What's the pattern of the world? The pattern of the world is homogeneity. The pattern of the world is that birds of the same feather flock together. The pattern of the world is distinguished for its allergy to differences. And Paul is saying, do not conform to that pattern. Whereas the religiosity that human beings construct, and there is no difference between religions in this respect, is one that absolutizes and idealizes allergy to differences. We'll see more of that as we proceed. So, the fear of being different as well as the fear of differences both together drive the religious virtue of conformity. The main religious virtue is conformity. You're considered a good Christian if you conform abjectly, habitually to whatever is prescribed for you. The church tradition. Nobody is even bothered about what Jesus taught. It's a church tradition. Conform with your eyes closed to the church tradition, then you are a very good Christian indeed. Now, what's the problem with this kind of conformity, and why does Paul warn us against it or advise us against being infected with this or being crippled by it? Conformity breeds intolerance. It's very simple. Conformity creates this illusion that homogeneity is the norm. It is the ideal state. And then if somebody is different, what happens? That person is an eyesore, right? And he has to be plucked out, thrown out. So conformity breeds intolerance, and this intolerance becomes the death dance of the diabolic or satanic. Well, I can only commend this to your continued reflection. So the fear of difference is therefore universal. Make no doubt about it. If you are a human being, you are infected with this fear of difference or differences. But this fear of differences is maximum in religion. And therefore, there is a concern all through the Bible, and I'll give one or two examples for want of time. There is a concern all the way through that this universal human limitation or malady of allergy to differences should be healed some way or another. Consider a very, very challenging instance like the case of Hosea the prophet. Hosea the prophet. God asked Hosea to marry a harlot, a prostitute. Why? Because God wants Hosea the prophet to understand the agony that he experiences in relation to the people. And that agony he can understand only when he experiences this in his own flesh and blood. Hosea the prophet, the man of truth, the man of purity, being asked to marry a harlot who is the most impure. In fact, from a social perspective, impurity reaches its climax in the case of a harlot or a prostitute because she's supposed to be highly polluted. Those who pollute her are all right, but she's polluted. So, here the prophet is made to deal with and live with differences, maximum difference. And when we come to the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus Christ, it becomes, in the Sermon on the Mount, it becomes the duty to love one's enemies. Love your enemies and pray for those who revile you and persecute you. See the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament in terms of this particular theme, that it is fundamental to our spiritual principle that we be trained to live with and to deal creatively with differences and not get intimidated by it. Now let me give you a secular illustration. All of us are familiar with the name of Socrates, the Athenian philosopher. I don't know how many of you know this, that Socrates married a woman called Xanthippe, and she was a woman of extremely vicious temper. Very, very ill-tempered woman. The story goes that Socrates chose to marry her, knowing this to be the case, because he wanted to perfect his temperament. And he knew that, therefore, the best aid for this purpose would be a woman like Xanthippe. To give ourselves a flavor of what this is, let me give you an episode from the life of Socrates. Socrates used to wander around, spending almost all his time trying to sort of educate the youth of Athens, and he was a lost cause as far as the family is concerned. He did not mind his domestic duties as much as his wife wanted, and this used to provoke her. But one day, when Socrates returned after his daily outing to educate the youth of Athens, he came and sat on the, shall we say, on the front room, and Xanthippe was very upset with him. She came and gave him a volley of abuses. And as was the custom with Socrates, he sat there without reacting, with a customary smile, accepting it all. This provoked Xanthippe even more, which is understandable. So what did she do? She went and fetched a pail of water and then splashed it on the head of Socrates. Socrates retained his good humor and he said, "After thunder, the rain. After thunder, the rain." Small wonder Socrates was a great soul. And that's the reason why European civilization cannot forget Socrates. And those who are familiar with his life and his teachings cannot forget him either. Now, so if this is a value both in spirituality and in philosophy, in politics of the most aggressive and malevolent, malignant kind, this is a terrible anti-value. Take fascism, for example. Fascism is the idolization of homogenization. I mean, you are familiar with the life of Hitler, of Mussolini, particularly Hitler. Hitler's greatest problem was his allergy to differences. He couldn't tolerate the Jews because they were different from the Aryan race. And he was sold out to the idea of the purity of the Aryan blood, the Aryan race, and therefore he decided to exterminate the Jews. So that's the origin of the Holocaust. But then there is another Holocaust which we must also talk about, the religious Holocaust, and we call it the Inquisition. Much like the great atrocity that happened, the horrible atrocity that happened in the fascist Holocaust, in the religious Holocaust, the pride of Europe, nearly 80,000 people were killed by the custodians of religion because they were different from the line that the church wanted them to toe. So we're dealing with a very major issue. I don't have the time to go into historical details, but I can only commend it to you to investigate further. So therefore, in the context of what I have mentioned so far, very briefly, we can understand that Jesus' foremost concern, as far as religion is concerned, is that we should overcome our religious fears, because fears become very acute, very aggressive, and very diabolic in the context of religion. Now, if we harbor fear in our hearts, and I define fear as a fear of difference arising out of our lacuna or inadequacy or inability to deal with differences. If we have the ability to deal with differences, we'll enjoy differences. But because we have not grown and developed and acquired the inner strength to deal meaningfully with differences, we fear these differences. And if we actually harbor differences in our minds, in our being, then we will be unfit for the mission of Christ. That is the reason why, as Jesus sends out his disciples on their mission, he instructs them particularly about fear. And that's the reason why we are focusing on this. So, what is the essence of religious fear? Religious fear is the fear of those who are religiously different from us. Now, this fear exists not only between religions, And it's important for us to realize that this fear is even more vicious and deadly and diabolic within a religion. Intra-religious allergy as against inter-religious allergy. Now, for example, consider the great allergy, the lethal, deadly allergy that the Pharisees experienced towards Jesus. Please read the 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the first, say, 5, 6, 7 verses. There, Jesus deals with this issue of religious offense. The context is not, in that context we don't have Pharisees. The context is John the Baptist, languishing in the jail, sends two of his disciples with a question to Jesus. Are you the one we've been waiting for? Should we look for somebody else? In reply, Jesus says to them, go and tell John that the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the dead are raised. Then he says something which is mind-boggling. He says, blessed are those who are not offended at me. Blessed are those who are not offended at me. Offended at what? Offended at the difference. You see, people are offended with Jesus because he was different from the stereotypical religious men of the times, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. You remember how the Sermon on the Mount ended? People were astonished at his teaching because he taught not like the Pharisees, but as one who had authority. So at every point, the religious establishment experienced the difference, the traumatic difference, if you like, between them and Jesus, and that explains this running quarrel, this what would eventually prove to be the mortal conflict between the two. So because of our religious conditioning, we have lost the capacity to deal normally and meaningfully with this world of differences. And that's why we make a great virtue of hating the world, Of course, there is this teaching in the Bible that the world is at enmity with God, but that's in a very different context. Don't mix up religious texts without understanding the context in which these teachings happen. So, the kind of allergy to the world that Christians have developed is completely different from the idea that there is this principle of enmity between God and the world. But please remember that God loves the world. That's the bottom line. So, the religious conditioning that we have undergone, or the religious conditioning inflicted on us from birth onwards, has crippled us in this particular, its most important aspect. And therefore, we are offended at anything and everything which is not convenient to us, which does not make us feel comfortable, anything which makes any demand on us, anything which we experience as unusual, unfamiliar, challenging, so on and so forth. This actually cuts us off from a large from much of life, actually, much of life. So, but there is a far greater problem, and that is our allergy to differences make us allergic also to God, because God is unlike us. God is unlike us, and that's why we say mysterious are the ways of God. Now, here we have a problem. The problem is we want God, but God is different to us in our nature, and we are allergic to difference. So what do we do? We have found a way out. The way out is that we will reinvent God after our own image. So this is the religious expectation that every Christian entertains, that God will be like us. In what sense? God will harbor my sentiments. God will only have my priority. God will operate according to my likes and dislikes. That's exactly reinventing God after one's own image. So, we are, if our expectations are not met, we will be really offended at God. And there is an illustration of this in the Old Testament, the book of Job. When things go awry and things go contrary to expectations, Job's wife experiences this problem in a very acute fashion. She takes it for a while, then she says, "Now curse your God and die." I can't think of a more dramatic illustration than this. I think it suffices. Let me move on. Now, unlike us, Jesus celebrated differences. Actually, he sought after differences. That's why he crossed all barriers. He dismantled all walls of separation, as Paul says. And in particular, Jesus rejected the Jewish allergy to differences. That's why he went into the land of the Samaritans. That's why he accepted the prostitutes. That's why he had fellowship with sinners and publicans, tax collectors, those who were despised by the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the Pharisees were actually crippled by their zeal for homogeneity. It was a mark of their weakness and ungodliness, which they mistook for their strength. So therefore, the sum and substance of what I have said so far is that we need to be alert to the fact, and it's an important fact, that the domain or the sphere of religion bristles with allergy to differences, because religion stigmatizes differences in the interest of promoting homogeneity or uniformity, which is somehow presumed to be the will of God. And I don't know on what basis, but this is throughout Christendom assumed to be the norm. Everyone should be a carbon copy of everyone else. I don't understand how this can be the norm at all. So what is the outcome? You look at the history of Christianity in Europe. The history of Christianity in Europe is soaked in blood because of sectarian wars. And what was the reason for the sectarian wars? 30 years war, 100 years war. It was nothing but the denomination-based allergy to difference. And each denomination looked at the other. Of course, in this case, the broad classification was between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. So one church looked at the other and found it was different in some respects, and therefore killed them. The differences, or the difference between the Catholic Church and the Reformed family of churches, is insignificant. It is actually a figment of people's imagination. But on the basis of that, rivers of blood soaked the soil of Europe. And therefore we can understand the agonized prayer of Jesus Christ in the 17th chapter of John's Gospel. There Jesus only prays for the unity of the people. Why? Jesus realized that this is going to be a huge problem, because universally in every religion there is this problem that people will be infected with intolerance towards difference, and that will certainly generate huge conflicts. Therefore the body of Jesus Christ will be decimated, will be broken up into 1,000 pieces. Jesus anticipates us and he agonizes over this, and the one thing he's praying for in the 17th chapter of John's Gospel is for the unity of the people. And particularly read verses 15 to 23. Verses 21, 22, 23 in particular, that they may be one even as you and I are one. That is the sum and substance of that text. So let us realize that we are suffering a major distortion on account of our religious conditioning, and that is we are robbed of our capacity to deal with differences. And that's why Jesus said, "Truly, truly I say to you, unless you turn back and become like children, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of God." Learn to live meaningfully, constructively, creatively with differences. That's a spiritual duty, whereas it becomes a religious scandal. And that's a contrast between religion and spirituality. Now, let's look at another very interesting aspect of this theme. We would like God to be as different from us as possible. Why? Because only one who is maximally different to us can help us. A beggar cannot help a beggar. A king can help a beggar, right? A sick man cannot heal a sick man. Only a physician who is not ill, who does not suffer from the same infection, can heal a sick person. right? So we would very much like God to be very different from us. What is the evidence for my saying so? Well, look at the worship. What are we doing in our worship? We are celebrating the difference of God as compared to us, right? God is so unlike us, and there is no end to the praise that we shower on God. As though God does not understand himself. He needs to understand himself only through our flattery. Why do we do this? Not because it makes any spiritual sense. In fact, it is spiritual nonsense to tell God what he is like. But we do it because of what I call the religious psychology. And what is a religious psychology? Please understand this very clearly. The sum and substance or the sole motive of our worship is to get some blessings from God. If possible, great blessings from God. Certainly unmerited blessings from God. Now, for God to be able to give these blessings to us, surely it is logical that God has to be as unlike us as possible. And therefore, in our worship life, we celebrate the difference between us and God. But in our practical life, we hate God when he is different to our whims and fancies. We are living this hypocrisy, we are living this contradiction, and nobody minds it, nobody talks about it. So, whenever it comes to our whims and fancies, we want God to be exactly like us. If God deviates by a nanometer to the left or right, we'll be very upset. We would like God to act the way we act, think and feel the way we act. At the same time, when it comes to worshiping God, he must be as unlike us as possible. This, my friends, is the essence of religious hypocrisy. And this was what Jesus saw in the priestly class of the times. Please read the 23rd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. It will make eminent sense in the light of what we have shared so far. Jesus sees nothing but hypocrisy in the priestly class for this reason. Let me state that reason once again in the interest of clarity, because it's very important that we understand it as clearly as possible. In the context of worship, God's difference from us is exalted to the ultimate extent. But when it comes to all practical issues, God's difference from us is reviled and disliked. We want God to be completely like us. For example, hate our enemies, do our biddings, think and feel the way we do, so on and so forth. And this was the problem that came to the fore in the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. The conflict was from the Pharisees' side, not on Jesus' side. So God is acceptable to us only as a tool, because, except in times of worship. That's why worship life is very different from our life as Christians, because as Christians we want God to be our tool, because then we can operate that tool. A tool is meant to be operated at will by the person who wields that tool. So the tool remains subject to the will and control of the person who wields it. Now clearly, if we read the account of God's creation, or the creation of everything by God in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, that's how the biblical account begins, we understand without any doubt that differences and diversities are ordained by God. It's part of creation. Creation cannot exist except on the foundation of diversity. And diversities are essential, they are beneficial. In fact, they nourish and beautify life. And life without diversity, differences, is unbearable. At the same time, we become so allergic to it. Why? I'll give you an illustration. If you have noticed people who fast, you see, in political context, people fast. Sometimes a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. I've known people who fasted, sincerely, fasted for more than 2 weeks. When they end their fast and they break their fast, they're not given a hearty meal. They're given very light, liquids. And slowly that is increased. Otherwise, if a person who has fasted for a week or 2 weeks is given a good meal, he'll die of it, because his body cannot deal with it. The same with us. We are spiritually famished in our busy religious life, and therefore we cannot face the spiritual duty to be creative in respect of differences, to be tolerant, to be welcoming, and to celebrate differences of all kinds. So, we hate those who are different to us, and we consider that to be a great achievement, a great virtue. Now, therefore, let me ask, we need to ask a question that might surprise most people, because such questions are never asked in Christendom. The question is this: is God a Christian? Do you really believe that God is a Christian? Or, let's ask further, is God obliged to feel, think and act like us because we are Christians? Shouldn't God be free to be God in spite of the fact that there are Christians? Right? Christians believe that God must do their bidding. And especially if you have a faith healer at your disposal. You know, the Christian God-men who mushroom these days because there is no sense of shame and there is no scope, margin for truth in our midst. They create the impression that God is at their beck and call. You know. So, now I'm going to leave these 2-3 questions I posed for your own continued reflection. Let me now turn our attention to another important aspect of the theme that we are trying to develop. A significant psychological aspect of religious fears is guilt. First of all, I said, and so far I've been saying, that religion is a domain in which allergy to differences is most acute as compared to in politics. It is in religion that allergy to differences is most acute. Now I'm saying that there is a psychological aspect to this. And that psychological aspect is the guilt that operates deep within us. And you can't miss it from the teachings of Jesus Christ. Let's examine this. The more we are riddled with guilt, the greater is the need to play up the differences between us and God, as well as us and other human beings. And in fact, when this is not handled properly, people in that state develop a psychological need to deny God altogether and embrace atheism as a means for mitigating their inner misery. The writer who alerted me to this reality is an Italian writer. His name is Joseph Mazzini, an author who influenced, by the way, Mahatma Gandhi, particularly this book that I'm going to refer to, that is The Duties of Man, is one of the, say, 14 or 15 books that Gandhi acknowledged as major sources of influence on him. And in that book, Joseph Mazzini says that man's need to be atheistical can be understood only in two things, in two ways. Either he is hiding a great and unbearable sorrow, or an unbearable guilt is wrangling in his soul. Easy to remember? Joseph Mazzini's explanation of the psychological need that people experience to deny God, to be atheistical. One, either it is because there's an unbearable sorrow lurking or hiding within the individual, or there is an unbearable sense of guilt. Now, religious guilt exaggerates the difference between us and all else, and in particular God. That's why guilt makes us run away from God. We have a foretaste of that in the first book of the Bible. Adam and Eve, after they disobey God, go and hide themselves. Now that's a very clear indication that this element of guilt has become operative for the first time in human history. It's a very, very significant moment in the history of human, the evolution of human consciousness, particularly spiritual consciousness. So it is in this light of the guilt that wrangles in the soul of human beings, which is then brought into the sphere of religion, that negative zeal must be understood. Negative religious zeal, the zeal to go and persecute people, as was the psychological predicament of Saul before he became Paul after his encounter with Jesus. So, Jesus, of course, again deals with it in the context of his teaching against judgmentalism. You find that in the 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 1 to 5. Jesus says, "Judge not, that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you measure, it shall be measured to you." In other words, Jesus is saying that you are judging people because of the sense of guilt that is lurking within you, and you need to deal with that first and foremost. So, Jesus' priority, therefore, is that we overcome religious fear and not that we go and convert others. Now, today, of course, if you ask any Christian, he would say that converting others must be the topmost priority so that the whole earth can be claimed for God. Jesus would say nothing of the sort. Come on, relax. First, overcome your fears. After all, your conversion project is actually driven by your fear, which you don't understand. You have not come to terms with it because you believe that you would be more secure as a Christian if the whole world is converted, because there is security in numbers. That's your motive, nothing else. You're not converting people out of love for them, though you say that, and that's because there is no limit to the hypocrisy that's operating. You may be unaware of it, but this is the truth. And that's what Jesus says. Read again the 23rd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. 23rd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus denounces this kind of conversion. The only time Jesus ever made a reference to conversion is this. And he says, you go here and there, you move heaven and earth to gain converts. But after they're converted, their state is 10 times worse than it was before. What a strong statement. So Jesus understands things very clearly because he is the truth. He knows that the psychological motive behind all this is a sense of guilt and the insecurity it breeds. Now a final word about the role that our allergy to differences plays in the way we worship God. God and worship and the challenge of dealing with differences. Now, most of us may not have realized this, but this is a simple truth that the religion we practice mirrors who we are. The religion, the mode of religion, you see, people think that there is one Christianity. There are as many Christianities as there are Christians. Each person is practicing Christianity in his own way. So, I am fairly convinced, after having witnessed all this, analyzed, sought, pondered over, agonized, that the religion we practice simply mirrors who we are. End of the day, we deceive ourselves if we believe that we are worshipping God. We worship only ourselves. That is to say, we worship only for our own sake, and therefore we worship only ourselves. We are not worshipping God. We are worshipping God because we think that that's the best way to maximize our selfish interests. And you call that worshipping God? No, you're only, in truth, the truth be told, you're only worshipping yourself. And in this process, God is used, as I said, as a means of wish fulfillment, something like a magic lamp. You rub the magic lamp and you get what you want. So, God is used then as a mirror to reflect our deep-seated personal likes and dislikes. And we impose and we project all that on God. So therefore, what happens? Because of our religiosity, because we are trained so well in our religious life, in our church life, we mistake those who are inconvenient to us as enemies of God. And this is a truth that cannot be gainsaid if you have even a nodding acquaintance of the history of Christianity, in fact, the history of any religion for that matter. So we actually force God to become party to our own weaknesses, our own pettiness, our own mean-mindedness, our own weaknesses. So the crushing burden that we carry, and this is where now the teaching of Jesus begins to shine like a beacon of light. The teaching of Jesus Christ will now rise like the morning sun over what we are going to now consider. Jesus makes everyone understand through his teaching as found in the 25th verse of the 12th chapter of John's Gospel, that the burden, 24th and 25th verse, these two verses, the burden we carry is our ego. You see, in the 28th verse of the 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." Rest, right? "Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." We're all leading a burdened existence. What is the burden we are carrying, my friends? It's nothing but the ego, the bloated ego. And this bloated ego is the seat of all our fears. And that is the reason why Jesus says in Matthew 16:24, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up the cross and follow me." Now, Jesus is not actually asking us to destroy ourselves. He is only asking us to deny our ego, which is the seat of all our fears, our prejudices, our anxieties, and which is also the location, the locale of the burden that we carry. In the psychological understanding of the human nature or the human mind, the self is much, much, much more than the ego. Ego is a very tiny part, the conscious part of the self, which is full of this self-centered considerations, our whims and fancies, etc., whatever I have discussed so far. So, as of now, before we really discover the true human beings, the true self that we are only this tiny, fear-ridden ego. It's a pathetic thing. It's a sad reality over which the loving heart of God agonizes. But the good news is this. The good news is this. There is a universe beyond the small little ego. And you have the right to enter that universe. You're not meant to live suffocated in this small little prison of the ego that you carry with you. And Jesus is the light that illumines your path to that cosmic universe, kind of enlarged self that you can be. It is this that Jesus meant when he said to Nicodemus, "You must be born again." Nicodemus, now you're carrying the burden of the small, little, tiny, narrow, slavish self, which has become an appendix to the religious establishment. But there is a glorious horizon for you, and God is merciful to lead you into it. But there is a prerequisite. You must be born again. You must shift from this foundation, the foundation of fear, the foundation of allergy to differences, and the allergy to intolerance, and the cruelties and the disabilities that issue from it incessantly. So, when you are born again as your true self, then you shall be completely free from this fear. Not until then. Fear stalks the faltering feet of human beings on planet Earth. To exist, as I said at the outset, is to live in fear. And as I quoted in one of the earlier sessions, a line from T.S. Eliot, "Son of man, you are nothing but fear in a handful of dust." Jesus addresses this reality because he loves human beings, he loves humanity. Therefore, he realizes that human beings cannot attain their true self if they are not liberated from the shackles of these fears, which are all rooted in the small little ego, which is the seat of the allergy to differences. We must accept the fundamental biblical truths that differences are basic to the order of creation that God in His wisdom, God in His abundant love undertook. We are part of that creation. Therefore, allergy to differences will cut us off from the grand scheme of things, the grand plan of God, within which alone we shall find fulfillment. To confine ourselves to this tiny prison is to destroy our freedom forever. And Jesus came to liberate us, and therefore he had to address, and he did address, the reality of fear. So we are liberated from fear and led to the broad spaces of God's love and God's positive, constructive, redeeming engagement with the world. And we are the inheritors of that great act of redemption. May God grant us the wisdom and the courage, the robustness of faith to claim that as our heritage. Thank you.